You stand in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, autumn wind carrying the scent of incense and fear through stone corridors. Your hands tremble as you arrange candles along the altar rail, watching noblemen whisper behind jeweled hands. Something is wrong. You've prepared countless royal weddings, but never has the air felt this heavy, this watchful. The great doors swing open. King Richard II enters first, 29 years old, golden-haired, moving with the practiced grace of absolute power. Then you see her, a child, so small that her crown seems to swallow her face. Her hand disappears entirely inside his gloved palm as they walk toward you. Isabella of Valois is 6 years old. Today, she becomes Queen of England. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm still amazed that a story this buried, this strange, can connect us across continents and centuries. The marriage took place on November 4th, 1396, recorded in chronicles that still exist in the British Library. Their ink faded, but their shock undimmed. This was not some backward custom hidden in obscurity. This happened in one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, witnessed by hundreds, celebrated with feasts that lasted 3 days, and it was completely intentional. Isabella wasn't just a bride. She was a weapon of diplomacy, a living treaty designed to end the bloodiest conflict medieval Europe had ever seen, the 100 Years' War. Her childhood would be the price of peace. To understand how a 6-year-old became queen, you have to understand the world that created her. Isabella was born in 1389 into the French royal family at a moment when her father, King Charles VI, was descending into madness. Not the romantic, misunderstood kind, the terrifying kind. Charles believed his body was made of glass. He would stand motionless for hours, screaming if anyone came near, convinced that touch would shatter him into fragments. Other times he forgot who he was entirely, attacking servants, refusing to recognize his own children. Isabella grew up in a palace where power was unstable, where her father might embrace her one morning and not know her name by evening. She learned early that the world was not safe, that love could vanish without warning. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, watched this chaos with calculating eyes. Isabeau understood what Isabella could not yet grasp, that royal daughters were currency. And in 1395, when English ambassadors arrived seeking peace after 60 years of war, Isabella became the most valuable coin France possessed. Richard II of England was grieving. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died of plague the year before, leaving him childless and politically vulnerable. Anne had been beloved, good Queen Anne, the people called her, and Richard had genuinely loved her, a rarity in royal marriages. But sentiment couldn't protect a throne. His advisors pressed him to remarry, to secure an heir, to strengthen alliances. When French negotiators proposed Isabella, they offered something irresistible. Not just a bride, but 800,000 francs and a 28-year truce. An entire generation could grow up without war. The cost was simple. Richard would have to marry a child. The negotiations lasted months. English lords argued fiercely. Some saw brilliance in the plan. The dowry alone could fund the kingdom for years. Others called it madness, a scandal even by medieval standards. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were sometimes married, yes, but 6. It set a precedent that made even hardened nobles uncomfortable. Richard listened to all of it. Then he asked to see her portrait. Court observers noted something strange in his reaction. He stared at the miniature for a long time, not with desire but with something that looked like tenderness. Perhaps the childless king saw not just a diplomatic solution, but someone to protect. Someone who needed him. The portrait showed a solemn little girl with dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. Richard gave his answer. He would marry her. In Paris, Isabella played with dolls while ambassadors drafted documents that would determine her entire future. Every detail was negotiated with legal precision. She would keep her French servants. She could write to her family. she would be educated at the English court, and, crucially, explicitly, written into the treaty in language that left no ambiguity, the marriage would not be consummated until she reached maturity. This wasn't hidden. It was the foundation of the agreement. Isabella was to be raised, not used. She was 7 years old when the reality finally touched her. Seamstresses arrived with cloth of gold so heavy she could barely stand in it. Tutors began teaching her English phrases she didn't understand. She was told she was going to marry a king. But what does marriage mean to a 7-year-old? It meant leaving home. It meant her mother crying in private where Isabella wasn't supposed to see. It meant a journey across water to a place where nobody spoke her language. The wedding at Calais was intimate and strange. Richard knelt to her level to exchange rings. She was so small that he had to lift her chin when she seemed frightened by the assembled nobles. Witnesses recorded his gentleness, the way he spoke to her in soft tones, the way he held her hand as if she might break. A year later, Westminster Abbey crowned her queen before a crowd so massive that 7 people were crushed to death trying to glimpse her. England had never seen anything like this. A child on the throne, tiny under a crown made specially to fit her head, processing through London streets while thousands called out blessings in a language she barely understood. Isabella's life in England became something unexpected. Richard didn't treat her as a wife. He treated her as a daughter he'd never had, visiting her apartments daily, bringing gifts, books, songbirds, musical instruments. She was given her own household, blending French and English attendants, and placed under the care of noblewomen who taught her everything a queen needed to know. She learned English quickly. She learned the difference between curtsying in the French manner and the English fashion. She learned which nobles could be trusted and which watched her with calculating eyes that saw not a child, but a political asset. She made friends. Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers, became her closest companion. Margaret was 9, worldly in the way older children seem to younger ones, and she explained things Isabella needed to understand. Why English lords watched each other so carefully. Why Richard's power, though absolute in appearance, rested on fragile alliances. Why Isabella's very presence in England was both protection and danger. The 2 girls would sit in Isabella's private garden, practicing needlework while Margaret whispered the real education. The family feuds, the old rebellions, the simmering resentments that might one day explode. For 3 years, Isabella's life had a strange kind of peace. She studied history and languages with tutors who treated her as genuinely intelligent. She learned to read maps, tracing the coastline between England and France, understanding how geography shaped the war her marriage was meant to end. She grew from a frightened child into a composed young girl who could navigate court politics with surprising skill. Richard seemed genuinely fond of her, and she began to feel something close to safety. Then, in 1399, everything shattered. Isabella noticed it first in small changes. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Her English ladies-in-waiting disappearing overnight. Richard's visits becoming rare and distracted. Margaret arriving one evening with fear in her eyes, telling Isabella to pack immediately. They were leaving Westminster, going to the Tower of London. For her safety, they said. But Isabella understood what the Tower meant. It was fortress and prison both, and she was no longer a cherished queen in training. She was a hostage. Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, had returned from exile with an army. The nobles who had tolerated Richard's rule were abandoning him with terrifying speed, flocking to Henry's banner. Isabella spent her 10th birthday in the Tower, listening to the sounds of a kingdom tearing itself apart. When Richard finally came to see her, the change in him was devastating. The confident king had become a haunted man, unwashed, his eyes carrying the same wildness she'd seen in her father during his worst episodes. He knelt before her as he had at their wedding and told her the truth. He might not be king much longer. He couldn't protect her. Her value now depended on what Henry Bolingbroke decided she was worth. Henry came to the Tower himself to assess his new asset. Isabella rose and curtsied with perfect formality, meeting the eyes of the man who had destroyed her world. He studied her carefully, this composed 10-year-old who had survived courts in 2 kingdoms. He asked what would become of Richard. She asked what would become of her. Henry's answer was deliberate in its vagueness. That depended on many factors: her father's response, his advisor's counsel, her own conduct. Isabella understood. She was a prisoner whose ransom was peace with France. The weeks that followed taught Isabella more about survival than her entire life before. Confined to the Tower but not yet formally imprisoned, she had to walk an impossible line, maintaining the dignity of a queen while never appearing to challenge Henry's authority. She was unfailingly polite, never giving offense, but she also refused to be treated as anything less than what she legally remained: Richard's wife, England's queen. Her French ladies-in-waiting became her lifeline, coaching her through the subtle performances required to stay valuable without becoming threatening. Then came the news that changed everything. Richard was dead, killed in captivity at Pontefract Castle. The official story said illness. The whispers said murder. Isabella received the news with the composure she'd learned to maintain in public, but in private she wept for the gentle man who had been the closest thing to a father she'd known in England. His death meant more than personal loss. It meant the last thread connecting her to her life here had been cut. Henry's government presented her with an ultimatum. She could return to France, but only if she acknowledged Henry as rightful king and renounced any claims to the English throne as Richard's widow. Accept exile and admit her 3 years as queen had meant nothing, or refuse and remain a prisoner indefinitely. Isabella, at 10 years old, faced a choice that would determine not just her future, but the relationship between 2 kingdoms. She never got to make it. Her father, during one of his lucid periods, demanded her immediate return. Faced with potential war with France, Henry's government agreed to release her. The terms were deliberately vague. Both sides could claim either voluntary departure or forced expulsion, depending on their political needs. In the summer of 1401, Isabella left England forever. The journey back to France was haunted by ghosts. She was leaving the only home she'd known for 5 years, abandoning the apartments where she'd learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she'd played with Margaret, the great hall where she'd been crowned. But she was also returning to a family that had become foreign. She spoke French with an English accent now. She preferred English fashions. She had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The 6-year-old who'd left Paris was returning as an 11-year-old woman shaped by experiences none of her French relatives could understand. Her father didn't recognize her. Charles VIII was deep in one of his episodes when she arrived, convinced he was being hunted by invisible enemies. When he finally emerged from the madness weeks later, he seemed confused by her presence, as if he'd forgotten she'd been sent away at all. Her mother, Isabeau, was warmer but also calculating, immediately considering how Isabella's unique status, widow of an English king, might be used to advance French interests. Isabella found herself caught between competing demands, questioned about English defenses and politics by her mother's advisors, expected to prove her loyalty to a kingdom she'd left as a child. The next few years were a strange kind of limbo. Too young to remarry immediately, too valuable to be left alone, Isabella navigated a French court that viewed her with mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She'd been Queen of England. She'd lived among the enemy. Some wondered where her true loyalties lay. Isabella herself wasn't entirely sure. She'd grown to love aspects of England even as she'd been held prisoner there. The thought of French armies invading in her name, ravaging English villages she'd known, horrified her. But she was French by birth, and France was now her only home. In 1406, a proposal arrived that offered escape from this uncertainty. Charles, Duke of Orléans, her cousin, 29 years old, sophisticated and cultured, asked for her hand in marriage. Isabella was approaching 16, old enough now for the marriage to be real in every sense. Charles wasn't seeking just a diplomatic asset. He'd met her, spoken with her, and found himself drawn to this remarkable young woman who'd survived courts in 2 kingdoms and emerged with dignity and tact. He promised to see her not as the former Queen of England, but as Isabella of Valois, an individual worthy of partnership, not just protection. Their wedding in June 1406 was everything her first had not been. Grand, celebratory, witnessed by thousands who cheered not for a diplomatic transaction, but for what appeared to be genuine affection. Isabella, now 16, walked down the aisle of Notre Dame with confidence, no longer a frightened child, but a young woman choosing her path. Charles waited at the altar with visible happiness. When they exchanged vows, they looked directly at each other, and observers noted how different this felt from the careful formality of most royal marriages. The early years of their marriage were intensely happy. Charles's court at Blois became a center of art and learning. Isabella patronized poets, commissioned manuscripts, maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe. She'd found intellectual companionship with her husband, discussing literature and politics as equals. When their first child, Jean, was born in 1407, Isabella felt something she'd never experienced before: complete safety. This child would know her parents' love, would grow up without being bartered between kingdoms. But medieval happiness was always temporary. Charles's father was assassinated by political rivals in 1407, thrusting Charles and Isabella into a brutal civil war between the Orléans and Burgundian factions. The cultured, artistic household transformed overnight into a military headquarters. Isabella found herself managing territories while Charles campaigned, using her diplomatic skills and organizational abilities to keep their factions supplied and their alliances intact. She'd become what she'd been raised to be, not just a decorative queen but a true political partner. Isabella's 3rd childbirth nearly killed her, leaving her frail and warned never to conceive again. The love she'd finally found with Charles became shadowed by fear, turning passion into restraint. Her health never fully recovered. The damage from childbirth left her vulnerable to respiratory infections and chronic fatigue. Yet she continued working, managing estates, conducting diplomacy, raising her children with the same intensity she brought to everything. She was determined that her son would grow up understanding both privilege and responsibility, that her daughters would have more choices than she'd been given. She drew on every lesson from her own childhood to shape their education. By 1409, Isabella's body was failing. The respiratory problems worsened into wasting disease, likely tuberculosis, though medieval medicine couldn't name it. She knew she was dying. She made careful provisions for her children's protection, worked to secure her husband's political position, and faced death with the same courage she'd shown throughout her life. She refused to become a burden, insisting on maintaining her daily activities as long as possible. Her bravery became legendary, inspiring songs that would outlive her. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1409. She was 20 years old. She'd been married twice, once at 7, once at 16. She'd been queen of one kingdom, duchess of another, and mother of 3 children who would carry her legacy into the future. Her funeral cortege was one of the largest medieval France had seen, representatives from across Europe coming to honor a woman who'd embodied both the cruelty and possibility of her age. Charles was devastated. He'd lost not just a wife, but a trusted partner whose intelligence had shaped his success. He eventually remarried, but he never forgot Isabella. Their children grew up to play significant roles in European history. Her son became a noted poet, her daughters made powerful marriages, all of them carrying forward the values she'd instilled: courage, compassion, the understanding that privilege came with obligation to others. But Isabella's real legacy lived in the questions her life raised. How do we measure a life that began as a transaction and became something genuine? She'd been given no choice in her first marriage, yet she'd found ways to grow within its constraints, to become not just a victim of circumstance, but an actor in her own right. Her second marriage was closer to her choosing, and she'd seized the opportunity to build something real: partnership, children, political influence. She'd transformed from pawn to player, from asset to agent. The medieval world that produced her was brutal in ways we struggle to comprehend. Children were married to seal treaties. Women were valued primarily as producers of heirs. Power was maintained through violence that seemed shocking even by the standards of an era that knew the 100 Years' War. Yet, within these constraints, Isabella carved out space for humanity. Isabella of Valois met a life of exile and duty with grace, compassion, and unshakable integrity. For 6 brief years, 3 in safety, 3 in love, she carved out moments of peace in a world that gave her none. Isabella of Valois, crowned queen at 6, widowed by 10, remarried for love at 16, and dead by 20, turned a life traded between kingdoms into one defined by courage, dignity, and humanity.